Resistance training can benefit the cardiovascular system, but in a manner different from conventional aerobic endurance training. In a study by Kramer et al., women who performed both resistance exercises and aerobic training together had a greater aerobic development than those who performed the aerobic training alone, even when dieting was involved. Dieting might decrease aerobic development due to weakness. Over years, support has been found for the concept that strength training augments the development of maximal aerobic capacity or running economy. Such data, in combination with the lack of data showing negative effects of maximal oxygen consumption with strength training, have encouraged some athletes, distance runners, to add supplemental sport-specific resistance training programs to their total training regime. Improved ability of the heart, lungs, and circulatory system to function under conditions of high pressure and high force production demonstrates the positive benefits of heavy resistance exercise in expanding the physiological capacity of the athlete. Since many competitive environments involve similar high pressure, when blood pressure might increase due to a very high values, and force production requirements, resistance exercises can prepare the athlete's body for such extreme competitive demands. Although very large increases in acute blood pressure, over 300 over 180 milligrams of mercury, have been observed in response to resistance exercises, especially when the Valsalva maneuver is performed, no data exists that indicate resistance training has any negative effects on resting blood pressure. For review, see reference 31 and 35. Male bodybuilders have lower blood pressure than either recreationally trained or sedentary men while performing resistance exercises at the same relative RM load. The ability to tolerate higher blood pressure in response to intense exercise may be viewed as a positive adaptation and a manifestation of extraordinary plasticity of the lifter's cardiovascular system in response to stress. Incorporating resistance training into an aerobic endurance training program can improve the ability of the heart, lungs, and circulatory system to function under conditions of high pressure and high force production. Resistance exercises, however, is not effective in increasing maximum oxygen consumption. One of the training effects of a conventional aerobic endurance training program is to increase an athlete's maximum oxygen consumption. Resistance exercises, however, is not very effective in training this variable. Conventional heavy resistance training programs do not increase aerobic power. The exception is in relatively untrained people, in whom increases in aerobic power ranging from 5 to 8% result from resistance training. But in general, changes in aerobic metabolism and performance are not optimally affected by resistance exercises. Even increases in maximum oxygen consumption from circuit weight training programs like load, short rest, and multiple exercises are lower than would be expected from conventional aerobic endurance training programs. See Chapter 7 for additional information on cardiovascular responses and adaptations. Body composition. Intense resistance training can cause changes in body composition. Resistance training can increase fat-free mass and decrease the percentage of body fat. Short-term resistance training programs typically result in slight increases in fat-free mass. The change in percentage of body fat depends on caloric intake and the metabolic intensity of the resistance training program. Continual long-term adherence to a heavy resistance training program appears necessary to achieve optimal increases in fat-free mass and decreases in percentage of body fat. In short-term programs, when caloric intake is not controlled, aerobic endurance training may be more effective for decreasing body fat stores due to higher caloric expenditures. Furthermore, it takes longer-term resistance training to develop enough muscle mass to increase the basal caloric expenditure related to resting metabolic rate. Thus, total conditioning programs are typically used to alter the body composition compartments, fat and muscle. Bone and connective tissue. The effects of resistance training on bone and connective tissue are discussed in Chapter 4. Elite competitive strength athletes have been shown to possess elevated levels of bone mineral in both the axial and appendicular skeletons, a change that corresponds with the athlete's extreme high levels of leg, hip, back, and upper body strength. It appears that the bone responds dramatically to increases of loading, compression, strain, and strain rates, which create the osteogenic stimulus. A general connective tissue response to aerobic endurance exercises that increase collagen metabolism. High-intensity loading of the musculoskeletal system results in the growth of the involved connective tissue and reinforcement of the cartilage matrix. Endocrine responses to anaerobic and aerobic exercise. Hormones play a multitude of important regulatory roles in adaptation to exercise training. Anabolic hormones such as testosterone, insulin, insulin-like growth factor, and growth hormone all influence the development of muscle, bone, and connective tissue. Hormones are involved with a wide variety of homeostatic mechanisms that are dedicated to keeping the body's functions within a normal range during rest and exercise. Increases in hormonal circulation and changes in the receptor level are adaptive responses to exercise stimulus. In general, during high-intensity exercise, the concentrations of hormones in blood and other body fluids can increase 10 to 20 times over levels at rest. Several exercise-induced mechanisms contribute to changes in hormone concentrations, including changes in clearance rates of the liver and other tissues, shifts in blood volume, hormone degradation, and receptor interactions. High-intensity aerobic endurance training augments the absolute secretion rates of many hormones, including epinephrine, in response to maximum exercise, although training athletes have blunted response to some maximal exercise. Their hormone concentrations equal those of untrained their counterparts at the same relative exercise intensity. Trained athletes may have more effective mechanisms for receptor binding interactions in their regulation of metabolic function. The greater hormonal response pattern to maximum exercise appears to augment the athlete's ability to tolerate and sustain prolonged high exercise intensities. When exercise is at a high intensity and short duration, from 5 to 10 seconds, only fight or flight changes in peripheral blood hormone concentrations are seen. Epinephrine and norepinephrine concentrations increase. Various types of resistance exercises increase most hormones in the blood. See Chapter 6. Hormonal fluctuations occur quickly and then stabilize in response to homeostatic challenges from both the initial demand and the acute exercise. And over long-term training, a hormone is concerned with providing a signal to the body to elicit a physiological action. When the action has been signaled, the feedback to the gland reduces hormonal output. This allows for increased stabilization of concentration, then a reduction to normal homeostatic concentrations. Changes in cortisol concentrations, for example, are directly linked to a variety of physiological functions. Cortisol monitors carbohydrate metabolism. When muscle growth glycogen concentrations, stored carbohydrate, are low, cortisol increases the signal a need to shift to other energy substrates, such as protein or fat, so that judicious use is made with little glucose that remains. While this is a negative or catabolic form, a muscle or immune cell perspective, the hormone is trying to preserve carbohydrate stores. This is only one feature of the cortisol's function as a hormone signal to the body to accomplish a specific task. Aerobic endurance training, especially running, is often associated with protein slowing from the muscle, partially induced by cortisol due to stress carbohydrates status, which the body attempts to offset by hormonal anabolic mechanisms such as testosterone and IGF-1. In the case of running, however, catabolic effects predominate and can lead to muscle degradation and reduction in power. It is not uncommon for elite endurance runners who are training with high mileage to be able to jump vertically only several inches. Thus, resistance training, the only way to significantly build muscle tissue, may be vital to offset the catabolic effects of distance running. A study by Kramer et al., aerobic endurance training was observed to increase both testosterone and cortisol in the blood in response to maximal treadmill exercise test. The same acute response was observed with a group that performed resistance training only. Over a 3-month training period, changes were observed in the blood concentrations of these hormones at rest and response to exercise tests. In general, aerobic endurance training group had a higher cortisol response and a reduced testosterone response, promoting a more catabolic environment in the body, even for muscle proteins. The resistance training group saw increases in testosterone but decreases in cortisol in response to exercise stress, indicating a greater anabolic environment. The impact of such changes is observed at the levels of the target tissue. In this case, skeletal muscle. In the study, a decrease in type 1 muscle fibers was observed, and the aerobic endurance training program, as increased degradation, helped reduce the size of the fibers. In contrast, the heavy resistance training group demonstrated an increase in type 1 and 2 muscle fibers due to the greater anabolic mechanisms enhancing growth. Cortisol and testosterone are involved in such mechanisms of anabolism and catabolism. How do hormonal changes influence these two different exercise-induced adaptations at a level of the cell? The target receptors in the muscle fibers determine whether the message, increased or decreased protein synthesis or protein degradation, is realized by the target tissue. Cortisol plays a key role in protein degradation in skeletal muscle, especially in type 1 fibers. Thus, no change or a decrease in testosterone with a commitment increase in cortisol fits the physiological adaptation strategy to high-intensity aerobic exercise endurance training or decreasing muscle fiber size. An animal study by Desenez et al. Shows that type 1 muscle fibers regulate their testosterone receptors in response to aerobic endurance training in an attempt to offset the large amount of protein degradation typical in these fibers with intense training. However, cortisol appears to have a greater response in type 1 fibers, where degradation is primarily to the status of the muscle size, whereas endurance training does not present a stimulus for increased size of the type 1 muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers fight getting bigger with resistance training due to a need for optimal size for oxygen kinetics and their function in the motor unit pool, i.e. repetitive oxidative tasks, by downregulating their testosterone receptors. However, cortisol's influence is also diminished by both at the levels of the receptor in the muscle and in the testes in men, which allows men to produce more testosterone. Nevertheless, the reduced influence of cortisol to promote protein degradation and some influence of the testosterone, at least in the initial stages, results in the hypertrophy of the type 1 muscle fibers. In response to heavy resistance training, it is important to remember that the type 1 muscle fibers gain size more by reducing the amount of degradation than that they do by increasing the amount of protein synthesis. Though both processes take place similarly, type 2 muscle fibers increase muscle size more by increasing the amount of protein synthesis by reducing degradation. Though, again, both actions take place. The testosterone receptors in type 2 muscle fibers are upregulated by resistance training, therefore increases in size, and show no changes with aerobic endurance training, i.e. they are most likely not extensively recruited for such training and they resist repeated contractions. To make matters even more interesting, other hormones, insulin, IGF, and growth hormone, also interact in the cell size optimization in response to exercise training. A classic study by McCall et al. Demonstrates that immunoreactive growth hormone, 22-KDA form, accounts for about 50% of the cell size increases with resistance training using the program targeted at increasing muscle mass. Thus, hormones interact to play an interesting role in the adaptations of muscle to exercise stress. It appears that the role of the hormone in the muscle remodeling is different in aerobic endurance and resistance adaptations. There are multitudes of examples of how hormones interact with target tissues in the body to maintain control and in some cases enhance the function of the target tissue in response to exercise training.